Yeah, David Cadotte was trained as an MD PhD at University of Toronto with Dr. Michael Fellings. So David is extremely knowledgeable about both the technical aspects and also medical aspects. He's a neurosurgeon, moved now in Calgary, and we've been collaborating for I think 15 years, as far as I can remember. And David was there before SCT even started, um, and it's been a great ongoing collaboration. So I'm glad that we are still in touch, and maybe also continue on like exciting projects relating to continuous learning in the context of spinal cord injury. And we also have the pleasure of having Kalum Ost, who is doing his PhD with David Cadotte. And so again, thank you very much, both of you, for speaking at our lab meeting today.
Great, thanks. And Kalum, can I say a couple things just before you start?
Oh yes, of course.
One of the things that attracted me to the position in Calgary was its uniform group with regard to seeing patients and things like that. So I'm mostly involved in with a patient population called cervical myelopathy, degenerative cervical myelopathy, and we see probably between 50 and 100 new patients with this diagnosis a year, and we try to collect as much data as we can on each of them. Shortly after I got started in Calgary, I came across Kalum. He actually presented himself to me, and I quickly learned of his great intellectual abilities in the area of data science and bioinformatics, and he's sort of carrying on that role. We've decided that our project is vaguely described in the realm of precision health. So we're working on techniques to learn from our patients, provide them with personalized information. And one of the challenges is, how do we integrate each patient's new story into our thinking about this disease process, and how do we offer them up-to-date information about their personal experience, knowing that we have this vast amount of data on other people that have had similar experiences. So Kalum recently wrote a really nice book chapter that is going to be published soon. And thanks to Julianne for reading on that and commenting on it. And Kalum will present some of his work on precision health that he tied his thoughts together in that book chapter. So Kalum, thanks very much for putting this together, and I'm looking forward to your group's thoughts and comments on this line of research.
Yeah, thank you. If you have any questions while I'm presenting, don't hesitate to just interrupt me and ask. And I wasn't sure of the expertise level of this group, to be honest. So there's some stuff that's probably going to be blatantly obvious to most of you. I'll try to breeze through it, but just sorry about that. All right, so today I'll be presenting on my proposal for data analysis techniques using precision health, or within precision health systems. And in this presentation, we'll go over what we need to consider for these precision health systems, as well as what I mean by precision health in this context, how we should try to store data for these systems and how we should manage it, how we should make systems to access and submit this data, as well as how we should explore and analyze this data, and then some future directions that my lab, I'm presuming your lab as well, and other labs are looking into that we can look forward to having and reaping the benefits of. So precision health in the context that I'm working in is to try to treat patients based on each person's unique characteristics, as Dr. Cadotte kind of described. It's also commonly known as precision medicine or personalized medicine. And an example of this is, instead of treating a patient and saying, okay, this drug works on 70% of patients with this illness, we instead look at this patient and say, okay, they have these genetic markers which are associated with this drug having side effects. They work in this occupation where this drug may not necessarily benefit and allow them to work as effectively. And they're male, and we know that there are complex side effects as a result of that. So this drug would actually be better, despite the fact that this drug actually works with 70% of said population. And the goal of this system is to try to make it so the treatments are more efficient. We're not wasting drugs on places that they don't need to be. And also to make it so that patients suffer less side effects, which not only makes the patient happier, but means we're spending less money. So there's a number of considerations that come into this. First is that this data is extremely highly varied. You guys worked with this data, you know full well how ridiculously varied this data can become. Each patient is unique and there's a lot of variation implicit in that. It also usually has slight errors due to collection artifacts. Even the best clinician occasionally makes a slip up as well, and you see that error slip into it as well. And that variation can contribute effective error as well. And then finally, because disease is ever changing, you can see changes over time as society changes, as patient habits change, as a disease evolves, if it's a bacteria, for example. And we need to have systems that can adapt to that. For example, with degenerative cervical myelopathy, or DCM, as Dr. Cadotte mentioned, very recently we're seeing the age that it appears start to shift to the younger generation. So if you were stuck with a static model, and that static model had learned that older ages were more associated with more severe DCM, that model might not necessarily be as accurate as it could be if it were able to adapt to those changes. And when we bring precision medicine into it, it becomes even more complicated because now we need to capture that massive amount of variation to find the variations that are associated with disease severity, which results in very complex models that we need to manage. These systems also need to be adaptable to change for very similar reasons. You can imagine COVID, for example, the Delta variant. It's changed suddenly, and if we're doing precision medicine, that's important to know. And then, obviously, why even bother if these systems are worse than humans? So we need to be as efficient and precise, at least to the point of competing with humans. So that's another consideration. For the data storage side of things, we suggest this data structure in our paper, where features are bundled together into forms that are sensible, use group demographics and demographics. MGOA forms are stuck together, similar to how you would manage a file folder, just digitally. These forms can also be nested inside of each other, so you can group MGOA and other metrics related to it into a super form that's, for example, maybe clinically collected data from a specific lab. And then finally, at the top of everything is a record where you group all of the forms together, and these records effectively act as a single entry for the purposes of data analysis. And this makes it very, very straightforward for data analysis because you know exactly all of the data that you require for one entry, and you know your N number almost immediately. If you're familiar with BIDS, this is very similar to how BIDS functions. So that's what we modeled our system around and attempted to make the system compatible with, given how prolific BIDS is. There's a number of benefits of the system and a few cons. The first is that we can easily remove or add new forms. Maybe a metric isn't worth collecting anymore. We can just say that the form's no longer available. Analytical techniques won't have access to it, but the data actually won't be deleted. And that's another major benefit, is that the data that we have in that database, it's just hidden. Like, analyses can't access it, but if we ever need it again, it's still there. As well, if we have a new form that's important, for example, maybe we discover a new metric associated with spinal cord injury that's informative. We can just write up a form very, very quickly, insert it into the database, and have it reflected in the database and web API very, very quickly. These form systems also make it very easy to make a schema for it, because the form will just report, I have this, this, and this. These are the data types for it, and you have it all nice and bundled for automated data analysis or collection. And then finally, arguably the biggest benefit is that you can bundle the analysis results and the outcomes right next to the data that's used to do those analyses. So coming back to DCM, our current goal is to make a model that can predict surgical outcomes. So we could build that model, have it predict the surgical outcome, have it stored in the document with the data that it was used to analyze. Then if the patient elects to go for surgery, see what the real surgical outcome is, stored alongside all of that again. And now we have the predicted and the outcome directly next to each other, and very, very easy to compare to see how effective our model actually is. There are some drawbacks though to the system, namely it's more complicated. You need a non-relational database to have all that dynamic add and removal system without having data loss. These web APIs also need to be coded dynamically to match the backend. So if we're building a website, the website needs to be able to adapt to the fact that a form might not necessarily have the same metrics that it had before. Similar with RESTful APIs, if you're familiar with those. And as well, because we have recursive forms, the data access becomes slower because you have to go down every single layer. This is usually negligible for anything but really large data sets where you're requesting all of the data at once, but it's still something to consider. And with federated learning, which is a future direction we're looking into, it probably won't be a concern at all, but that's not something we're quite ready with yet. Oh, my apologies. So now that we have all this data, how do we actually analyze it? We previously tried to do linear models, linear and logistic, very simple models, but they don't capture everything that we need. There's complexities that just aren't able to be accounted for with those models. Neural networks, which we tested, are much better, and we'll show that in a little bit, but they're extremely time intensive, especially if they're static, because every time we receive new data, we need to basically rebuild it from scratch. And if you've worked with neural networks before, you know that takes ages, and we can't really afford to do that. 1 second here. There we go. And then we found that by training a model iteratively over time with new batch data, we effectively resolve both problems. We get the benefits of the accuracy of a neural network, but we don't have the time intensity every time we need to update it every single time new data is available or made available to us. So new patients are collected. This brings us to our continual learning framework, also known as the progressive learning framework. This is derived from Dr. Fayek et al.'s work in just last year, if you want to dig into that. But it's split into 3 stages. Firstly, we progress the model. If the model doesn't exist, this is where we initialize the model, and we just add some new neurons to the system based on the previous metrics. These can be informed based on how accurate the model was previously. If it's overfitting, maybe we add less. If it's underfitting, maybe we add more. And we're basically just building up the model to try to account for any new changes that the previous network structure might not be able to account for. We then train these new neurons plus the previous neurons if we have a pre-existing model with on the new data that we have available to us, potentially mixed in with some prior data, that this can lead to it overfitting and stagnating. We're still testing where the threshold lies there. And this just allows the new trends to be caught onto. If old trends are no longer relevant, the neurons can adjust to ignore them. You've worked with neural networks before. That's a training step. And then finally, we prune back any neurons that aren't actually contributing anything. For example, maybe a neuron's just contributing redundant information. They're doing the same thing. We can cut it back and the model won't actually suffer for it. It's also entirely possible that a neuron will just start fitting to noise, and then we can cut it back and reduce that overfit. And we've seen that this actually produces quite a nice bit of accuracy. Plus, it makes the model faster because you're doing less calculations. And then we can just continually repeat this over and over and over again until we have all the data or as long as we keep collecting new data. And if we put all of this together, we get a really nice model. So just a quick description of what this is. Orange is testing accuracy, blue is training accuracy. So we can see here that it's actually underfitting when we're just doing a static convolutional neural network model. And then if we allow it to progress while freezing prior neurons, it actually becomes worse because it's effectively getting locked in place. But if we allow it to update those prior neurons, we get a better accuracy of around 85%. When we start submitting data in batches, like we would in a clinical setting, it does dip initially, but when we allow it to progressively learn and update its neurons through the system we described, we basically get results near identical to a static model trained on all of the data made available at once. So we've recovered almost all of it. But you can see as well, it starts to overfit. And that's the one problem we found with this network, or this framework, sorry, is overfitting is poisonous to it. It's more poisonous than it is with normal models. It just kills it. And this is really shown with the DenseNet model, where it's a much more complicated model, having a lot more connections, leading to overfitting a lot more often. We still see some benefits with full batch data, but when we have to submit data in batches, it just tanks because it overfits almost immediately to the batch. It just starts memorizing and doesn't actually learn anything. And while we still see benefits from allowing it to progress and iteratively learn, it's not good. So finding ways to find the balance between model complexity and overfit is one of our future goals, and try to identify a methodology to find that sweet spot. So that brings us to our future directions. The one that I mentioned a while ago is federated learning, where instead of having the data all stored in one central repository, it's distributed across multiple, with each of their labs contributing to their own little data repository, and then having the model learn from all of them kind of in turn. This is still an ongoing field of research, so how effective it is only starting to be determined. So far, so good, but there's still more to be learned there. This also has a security benefit because now if you compromise one lab's data, you're not compromising all of the data in the data set. We're working with patient records, anonymity is key. We also have a few algorithm optimizations we want to look into. Right now, pruning doesn't actually remove the neuron, it just tells it to ignore it, which improves computational efficiency, but it means the memory will infinitely grow until you overflow the system. Not good. We're almost certain this can be resolved, we just haven't done that yet. And then finally, as I mentioned, figuring out which model is a good fit for the given illness. In DCM, right now we're suspecting either DenseNet or ConvNet will work best, though we still need to do more tests. And finding a way to empirically get to that point without just testing everything under the sun is something that we really want to look into, given how overfit is really, really poisonous to this framework. All right. Thank you very much for listening. Any questions?
Thank you so much. I guess I'll start breaking the ice with a couple of questions.
Okay.
I guess I'll maybe ask like a few questions and then give the mic to others. My first question is really more about the rationale that you started presenting. It was all very clear, very well articulated. So congratulations on giving the big picture and also enough details so that we get the idea of what you did exactly. I know this is hard to do. So yes, you on the pros and when you compare the pros and cons of this data structure, you mentioned that a pros is that so the pros of having the analysis results alongside the stored data. This is a debate we keep having with David, and you gave the example of like exactly, like a patient where the prediction would be stored within the database, and then we can actually at some point add also the outcome and then compare. But this, when you do this comparison, you essentially want to evaluate a method or like publish a paper on like a new method that you came up with, right? So and when you do that, then you would create like a code base, right? That you would version on like July 2nd, 2021, right? So you would use that code, and then you would say that I use that code and then I trained my data, and then the data would also be version tracked, would be identified, and it would be on the the 150 patients that you've acquired so far. You would have the prediction for all those patients that you would calculate during your actual experiment, and then you would compare it because you have the ground truth, which is the outcome, right? So I don't see with that scenario and that approach, I don't see the benefit of actually storing the prediction because you only need the prediction when you want to evaluate a model, and model evaluation should be done after you have the actual outcome, because you need the outcome in order to train the model.
Yes, but keep in mind that we might want to inform patients as well. So if it's surgical outcome, before they go into surgery, you might be, okay, based on our current model, this is how we predict it will go.
Okay,
and then a clinician can look into it and be, okay, based on my expertise, that's correct or that isn't. And then they have a more informed decision ahead of them.
Okay, that's interesting. That's great. Yeah, it makes sense. And then you could actually update, like let's say you create a new model and then you have like an updated version of this prediction. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and with the continual learning model too, it's always updating. So as we just get more and more data, it becomes more and more accurate in theory. So far it seems to hold, but we haven't tested over a 10-year time span. It might decay at some point.
Right, and you want to version track that, obviously. Cool, thank you.
I think part of the big picture here is getting clinicians and surgeons to buy into this big project. And one of my thoughts on that is to give them data. So along a lot of the things that Kalum didn't talk about are sort of in the background, but we're developing an interactive portal where surgeons will have access to a patient's data before they even meet them in their clinic. So when the patient comes to the clinic, the surgeon will have a printout summarizing all of the baseline data and our predictions. And whether they use that or not would be up to them. And as our models grow and evolve, that prediction section of our documents that will be available will change and evolve over time. So, you know, with any system like this, there's a complex interplay between technology and really old school medicine, because you have to remember that a lot of our surgeons make decisions based on 10, 20, 30 years of experience and don't see the need for these, intensively complicated systems. They've never done a degree in computer science or data analysis like that. So we're really trying to move the field forward by meshing new technologies with simple printout reports that surgeons can wrap their minds around.
Yeah, that's another reason why we chose to kind of replicate the file folder system when it comes to the data storage solution, because not only does it have all the benefits we showed, it's relatable to people who have worked with file folders for 10, 20 years. So they understand how the data is stored implicitly. We don't have to train them as much.
Yep, makes sense.
All right, any other questions?
So thank you for the presentation. And my feedback is not going to be much on the AI side of things, but I am interested about this data standard and the organization of the data. In particular, you mentioned that the BIDS was kind of an inspiration for what you're doing. Can you comment a little bit about the parallels, and do you think that that kind of interoperability could be a benefit in the long run, especially because our lab is running a couple of different BIDS extension proposals. So it's nice to see that BIDS is gaining traction.
Well, the reason we chose BIDS is because it's so prevalent and it's so dynamic. There's no set in stone requirements outside of the overall schema, really. And one of the major benefits is the ability to nest forms and have external fields just fall through to inner forms, my apologies. So that was really what we tried to replicate. And if your BIDS extensions go through, this system is dynamic enough to just fold them in very easily. So if you already have BIDS data, it's pretty easy to replicate using this system because they're meant to work together, basically. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks.
Okay. Pardon?
Nick, you had a question?
Yep. Okay, so I do have a question about the AI thing. I'm more on the data storage system inside, but could you review for me? You went pretty quickly over what do you call it? Your charts that showed overfitting for the newbies like me in the crowd. Can you just say, you're saying that where the blue line goes over the orange line, that's overfitting?
Yep.
Is that because the blue line is the test? No, the blue line is the train. Or
the blue line is
the
training,
orange line is on
orange
the
is
fold-out
testing.
set, and the blue line is on the.
So if the blue line is
going
going higher than,
I see. So and you
go ahead.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And so this final concept chart has, you said it has about the same, its orange line is about the same as the original static line. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, so we measured it in two measures, which we didn't show here, which is best accuracy overall, which this one actually performed about 1% better, and then best accuracy per cycle. So what is the accuracy for each of these cycles here? And best accuracy per cycle for this was less, but given its batch data, that's not really surprising. But the average was like 2% different, and then this had a better accuracy overall than this one, which is to say that even though we're submitting in batches, which makes it more prone to overfit, makes it harder for the model to actually learn anything, it's still performed almost identically to just submitting the data all at once. And submitting all the data at once is kind of the gold standard, where we can just
right. And you don't you don't want to do because that's very expensive. And
it's very intensive.
Like,
it might start to try to
right.
It might start to fit to trends that are no longer relevant if we have really old data.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also just because we have to retrain it every single time, and it takes several hours on a supercomputer, which most hospitals don't have. All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have Naga, I think.
Oh, yeah, I had a question. Thank you for the presentation, first of all, Kalum. So my question is more related to the continual learning aspect. So in what I've read, which is very less, I know that continual learning systems have this problem of catastrophic forgetting. Did you experience that in your work? Or I mean, I noticed that you didn't mention any cons while training. Would that be one of the cons in the continual learning settings, or does your method already solve that?
The thing is catastrophic forgetting is only a case where we need to go back. So with many continual learnings, you're wanting to train it on something and then have it be able to return to those things later. So maybe you train it on, how do I explain this? Maybe you train it to learn how to analyze dog images and determine dogs from cats. And then they're similar enough to identifying raccoons from baboons. You can, a continual learning could take the learning it learned from cats and dogs and then learn how to do raccoons from baboons. It then still needs to be able to go back to cats versus dogs. And that's where you get catastrophic forgetting. With our system, because we don't really need to backtrack, because we're expecting trends that are old to not be relevant anymore, catastrophic forgetting isn't nearly as much of a concern as it would be in more classical continual learning applications. Because we're probably not needing to check again. Somebody's already gone through surgery. We don't need to go back and run the analysis again on them. It's not really relevant to them anymore.
I would argue otherwise, because if ultimately you want your model to generalize well, the concept of generalization should include as many patients across time and across sites as possible. So if your model is like divergent towards like better accuracy for like the latest 2 months of data sets, we could also argue that it might be like a combination of catastrophic forgetting and overfitting for the latest 200 patients. And I think the oldest one should also be considered in terms of testing to make sure that your model still generalizes well.
That's fair.
Just to follow up, I mean, I just wanted to follow up on Julie's comment. I mean, what I had thought was in continual learning settings, I mean, it's good to aggregate as much as, as much the model has learned in order to go to the new task. So when you say that if we have a patient's surgery as what has already been done, wouldn't it be useful to understand what was essential during that surgery when considering the next surgery or next any n number of surgeries?
Yeah, it's definitely a concern. It's just less of a concern. And how we solve that without it just stagnating, because that's what this progressive frozen thing here is. It just freezes prior neurons rather than allowing them to be updated, and it just performs worse overall because it's getting locked to prior trends effectively. And this was trained on a CIFAR data set, which was modified to replicate clinical scenarios where trends change over time and you won't have balanced data sets. But how we solve that is very much a concern, because you do see it does start to overfit anyways. So there is some of that. And I think the way we could fix it is basically just allow it, when you're submitting new batches, to also dope them with older data. So it still has that older data, keep effectively constantly reminding it about prior trends, but not so much that it gets locked to them. And you're also effectively artificially inflating your data set that way too, which just means a better model usually, as long as you're not overfitting.
Yeah,
not
is this
only,
something related to?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, sorry to interrupt. I mean, I thought, is this just related to experience replay? That's one of the things, I guess, in these settings.
Mhm.
Oh, well, okay, yeah, I was just speculating. Yeah, thank you for your answer, yeah.
No problem.
Just to follow up on that, and like trying to wrap my head around, why do we absolutely need continual learning? So one of your arguments is that it takes, a lot of time to train. Well, if we put this into perspective, a lot of time is, a couple of hours or maybe one day. And if you train a new model, every week or every 2 weeks, and it's trained in the background, is that really a problem?
It's a combination of that and the fact that trends might change over time, and we don't want it just continually getting stuck in prior trends, which is finding the balance between prior trends that are still relevant versus ones that aren't. And continual learning helps it just start to forget those trends that are not as relevant anymore over time.
Trends being, for example, like the type of data, if someone adds like a new MR sequence, or if the population changes over time.
Yeah, because the neurons that we add in the progressive don't have to be the same type as the prior neurons. We can just say, oh, there's a new input. Here's a whole bunch of new input neurons that are specific to that type. Yeah. And it can start to learn how to analyze that. Or if data becomes removed, it can start to learn how to work without it.
So that's a fascinating hypothesis. It definitely needs to be validated, but it's a fascinating hypothesis. Yes.
And this is still in the testing stage. How much we need to make it continual versus static is still up in the air.
Yeah. Like playing the devil's advocate, like studied like, diving into deep learning by saying that simple models don't capture everything we need. We could ask, is that so? Was that tested, validated, and like how? Because we'd always think of a linear model where you put, like 35 regressors. Was that tested? Was that compared to the deep learning approach?
So we did. That's what the static model is here. This is just all data available static default model set up with training the same number of training epochs overall. And it has worse accuracy than progressive when giving all data, and then it's again similar trend. Even with the DenseNet, that's just worse overall. We see that similar trend of accuracy improving when we allow it to iteratively learn.
But that is still deep learning, right? I was thinking of simpler like approaches.
Oh, like linear regression, SVM stuff.
Okay.
Exactly. We haven't tested SVM. We did test linear logistic regression, and we only got around 60% accuracy there. Versus this. That being said, we still need to test it on the actual MRI data. We just tested it on a simulated CIFAR-10 data set. And that's our next step, is what I'm currently working on for the next few months.
Okay. So far, these results are from the CIFAR.
Yes, these are theoretical proofs of concept.
Right. So I guess my next question would be, what would be your input data?
Our input data was Are you talking about like for the next step or for this?
For the next step.
The next step, it'll be our MRI data plus patient demographics, which will be respectively handled by a convolutional neural network, be it a classic convent, a DenseNet, or other ones that we're planning on testing, paired with we're thinking depth 2 perceptron for the demographic and non-convolutionally related data. And then we're going to see how effective that is and start to tune it and see if we can get a pretty good accuracy out of it. I'm confident we can based on previous results, but.
So now if we dive into the MRI data, so in a session, there are different contrasts. And if we look at just one contrast, it's a volume of, like 100,000 of voxels. Will you consider them all? Will you do some sort of processing? Will you try to reduce the dimensionality? What's going to be your approach here?
Well, we're going to standardize the voxels to, I do believe we were going to do 1 millimeter cubed was the current plan, though we might tune that around. Filtering, I was actually going to ask you if you had any insight into how to best approach an MRI filter, because obviously we don't need to know what their shoulder looks like generally. We just need to focus in on their spine. So if you have techniques on how to filter down the data, that would be appreciated.
So I think we should think of an like maybe a multi-steps approach where we would first, like I think the key is really to reduce the dimensionality, because you're throwing in your model, like you're already struggling with overfitting.
Yes.
You don't have like millions of subjects. In fact, you likely have hundreds of subjects. So, and a single MRI volume has 100,000 of voxels. So you need to reduce the dimensionality.
For sure.
Question is how to do that. So there was like Luca was a master student who was actually working on that. And at the end of his master's, the conclusion was that, so, he tried training models to predict outcome on the AO spine data set. It didn't work because he was throwing all the MRI data in there. Question. So in terms of reducing the dimensionality, we could start simply with segmenting the spinal cord, or like finding where the spinal cord is, and then creating a mask around the spinal cord that will already reduce the dimensionality by factor 50 or 100. Next step would be to identify where the lesion, where the compression site is, and I think it could be robustly done with deep learning, especially if the data are coming from the same site. With probably with more than 95% accuracy, we can find where the compression site is. Then you can create maybe a box around this compression site and then throw these voxels in, right? It will reduce the dimensionality a lot. And maybe do that for the different contrasts. Yeah.
We were thinking of also just focusing on T2W sagittal, just because it's some of the most prolific, at least here. So we can assume it's generally available and just focus the model on making it really, really good at that specific methodology.
Yeah. So, yeah. And if you want to, I mean, yeah, it makes sense. And like coming back to the dimensionality reduction, if we want to reduce that further, then we could also extract metrics from them, right? For example, from the T2, finding automatically what's the anterior-posterior diameter in the in the highest compressed site. And reporting that as a number and putting that number as an input of your network.
At that point, I think prior research suggests SVMs are better then, though, because neural networks just are basically stuck being overfit. And this pruning helps a lot with dimension reduction too, because it can prune inputs. So it will detect this input isn't helping, cut it, and then, okay, it's still working fine. That being said, if we're going all the way down to metric extraction, I think SVM is a better approach at that point.
And this is great. And my last comment is, so we are, as you know, we are really interested in similar projects for SCI, but also for MS. And yeah, we really want to start playing with federated learning. And so we should collaborate on that. Maybe we can, try like a test bench between our two sites. Maybe we can gather data from Toronto. We can ask the Toronto site to share data with us. We would bitsify them the same way you do it, following your exact structure that you have in Calgary. And then, it would be like a first experiment of a two-site federated learning.
Okay. Excuse me, sorry.
We're planning, we're writing actually two separate methods sections for two separate projects that we're polishing before we present them to you. And it sort of gets to some of these ideas. And one of them is actually what I really want to find out and what I want to convince myself of, and me and the people that pay for it, is should we engage each of these patients in a quantitative MRI data set to help our models? So right now we have just less than 100, between 80 and 100 of these patients have a full quantitative MRI data set that includes perfusion imaging, magnetization transfer imaging, etc. And about 350 or 400 now have standard clinical imaging.